So I mentioned at the beginning of Mass that this is our first weekend on campus with students. And so always, the thing that strikes me is the fact that this is the season of questions. As you get to know people, it's just like all the whole list of questions, like where you're from, what's your major, all those kind of things, which makes sense. It's there. It's how you get to know someone. And I was thinking about this, like that's your whole life. Like our whole life is answering questions. I mean, I was just even thinking, I got to spend a little bit of time last weekend with some of my family members, and even a little kid like James. James, how old are you? James, and he's like, I'm, this many, or he can say it now, so he can say, I'm 3. But that sense, I mean, even a little kid, how old are you? I'm 1, 2. The questions is how you get to know someone. And oftentimes when you ask someone a question, they're the ones who answer, but sometimes, I don't know if you've seen this with like adults or parents, they sometimes answer for their kids. Like they just introduce everybody. I was talking to one of my friends and he was sharing the fact that he's like, yeah, I introduce all my kids like this. This is Christian, he's 18, he's doing this and this, and then this is Esther, she's this old. And it's just kind of one of those situations where it's kind of like you're taking the ability to answer the question away from the kid. And I'm so guilty of this. I'm the most annoying introducer of all time because like a lot of times I'll do this, where I'll introduce someone and rather than letting them ask questions of each other, I'll be like, oh, this is Katie. Katie is from Nebraska. Well, she didn't grow up in Nebraska. She grew up in St. Louis, but she went to school in Nebraska, go Big Red, this whole kind of thing. And so when people say, well, Katie, where are you from? I've already answered for her. Like, they don't even have any questions. So it's like, well, did you like Nebraska? And she's like, are you an idiot? Of course I did. Like that sense of, it's annoying because I take someone else's answer and I give it for them. At the same time, it's kind of funny because we have the whole focus team here with us as we got to know each other, because we don't all know each other necessarily. Last week, we had this thing where we had dinner. And at first it was like, okay, everyone introduce themselves. And then it was like, that's fine, but it can get kind of long. And so as an interactive way of doing this, it was like, okay, say something you know about that one person. So it's now Katie. So everyone will go around the table and say one thing you know about Katie. And it was a great way to like introduce each other. So yes, taking someone else's answer can be annoying and also can be kind of fun. I thought it was kind of fun. It was pretty fun. I learned something about myself that people realize. Anyways, going back to this question is there are some questions that other people can answer for you, but there are other questions that aren't like that. There are some questions that anyone could answer for you. But there are some questions that aren't like that. There are some questions that only you can answer. In the gospel today, there's 2 questions that are asked, right? Jesus goes to this place called Caesarea Philippi, about 29 miles north of Capernaum, where Jesus has his home base. And he asks 2 questions and he says, who do people say the Son of Man is? Who do people say that I am? And then he asks the next question, who do you say that I am? But it's really fascinating. I think there's a third unspoken question that can't remain unanswered. And the third question is, well, let's pause. Before we say, what do other people say Jesus is, or who do you say Jesus is? The question is, who does he say that he is? And this is really, I think this is critical. This third question that Jesus doesn't ask is a question that Jesus answers. Who is he? Who does Jesus say that he is? I mean, because right when Jesus asks the question, who do people say that I am? There's answers all over the place. There's Elijah, John the Baptist, Jeremiah come back from the dead, one of the other prophets. And that's kind of the answer that I think our world gives. Like, yeah, who's Jesus? Great teacher. One of the answers people give in our world is like, gee, who is Jesus? Well, he maybe even one of the greatest teachers of history. He's up there with Confucius and Buddha and Zoroaster and Plato and Socrates. Like, he's great. Awesome. Great answer. Who does Jesus say that he is? That's a question that we have to ask. It's a question that we have to answer. And only he can answer. This is a question that only Jesus can answer. Who does Jesus say he is? And the answer is, Jesus says that he is more than just one of these teachers. He's more than just a prophet. Jesus says that he is God. And this is something that we can't dodge. In fact, he says it in some ways that are really obvious, in some ways that are super subtle, but are really powerful. For example, the really obvious, at one point, Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am, essentially equating himself with God. In fact, the reason why the Jews are bringing charges against him is because they say to him, we're not charging you for anything you've done other than the fact that you have made yourself a mere human equal to God, because Jesus made it clear that when he claimed the name I am, he was claiming the name of the only God who exists. Jesus also goes on to say that he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He doesn't say I'm one of the ways. I can teach you the truth. I can bring you life. He says, I am the life. I am the truth. I am the way. Jesus, describes himself as the one who will come to judge the living and the dead. He will judge all of humanity. He will judge all of history. It will all be his to judge. I mean, these are things, when Jesus says this, he is claiming to actually be God himself. In fact, I don't know if you remember this in the Gospels. Jesus says, if you love father or mother more than me, you're not worthy of me. Jesus says, I take precedence over even the deepest and most profound and most important relationships in your entire life. He can't do that if he's just a teacher. No teacher could do that. But he can claim that if he's actually claiming to be God, and he is claiming to be God. He claims to be able even to forgive sins. And only God can forgive sins. So, question, who does Jesus say he is? And the answer is really clear. He says that he is God. He is the God. And this is so vital because, a lot of times we approach Jesus as just one among many. That he's just another holy person among many holy people. He's just another good person among a bunch of other good people. That he's just a good, wise person amongst other good and wise people. And that's what people say. Like, honestly, in our culture, to answer that question, who do people say Jesus is? They'll say things like, well, I believe he's a holy man. I believe he's a good man. I believe that he was a prophet, but not that he's God. C.S. Lewis, my pal, C.S. Lewis will say, that's actually the one thing we can't say about Jesus. The one thing we can't say about Jesus is that he was a good man, but not God. The one thing we can't say about him is that he was a wise man or a holy man, but not God. Why? Because Jesus claimed to be God. And if he's not, then he's not good. If he's not God, then he's not holy. If he's not God, then he's not wise. In fact, C.S. Lewis gives us, we have only three options. The first two are, if Jesus is not God, and he knows he's not God, then he's a liar. If Jesus isn't God and he doesn't know he's not God, then he's crazy. Let's look at this for just a second. You might have heard this before, but I think it's worth going back over. Again, this is our first weekend on campus, and it's one of those questions I think it's really important because Jesus is not simply another teacher among many teachers. Jesus is claiming to be God, which means that if he is, he gets everything, and if he's not, he gets nothing. So, say he wasn't God, and he knew it. He was lying. One of the things we know about someone who is that kind of a con artist, that kind of a narcissist, is that they have that kind of tendency, right? They're the tendency, they're selfish, they're self-involved, they're narcissistic. And yet, when you look at the Gospels, every time you see Jesus doing something, he's not doing it for himself. He's not manipulating others. He's giving of himself for others. What's he get? He gets nothing. He gets exhausted. He gets tortured. He ultimately gets killed. I mean, again, the kind of person who would pull off a con like that is just interested in what they can get. But even there's this one moment in the Gospels where Jesus even says, I'm exhausted. I'm spent. And he says to the disciples, let's go away and let's just pray. Let's go away and let's be with the Lord. Let's go away and just rest. And as they go away, all of a sudden they happen upon this crowd of people that's looking for Jesus. In that moment, I know what I would do. In that moment, I know what a con artist would do. They would say, let's keep going. Let's head down the shore and find a quiet place. But Jesus sees these people and his heart is moved with pity for them, with compassion for them, because they're like sheep without a shepherd. And he goes and he heals them. That's not the action of a liar. And no part of Jesus' life reveals the actions, the behavior of a liar. So, okay, maybe if he's not God and he's not lying about it, maybe he's not God, but he doesn't know it. Maybe he's not God and he's actually deluded. Because there are people who actually think that they're God. There are people who think that they're Jesus. Well, we have to understand this. To be sane is to be connected to reality. To be insane is to be disconnected from reality. And the more I'm disconnected from reality, the more insane I am, if that makes any sense. So here's an example. If I were to say to myself, or to you all, I'm a priest. That's true. That's in conformity with reality. If I were to say, I am the best priest in the world, no, that is not true. But if I believe that, maybe you could tolerate being around me for 5 to 10 minutes, but after about 5 to 10 minutes, you'd realize, wow, this guy is not all there. Like, he genuinely believes that he is the greatest priest alive. You'd recognize it pretty quickly. If I thought, I'm Pope Francis, hola, ¿qué pasa? And I genuinely thought that I was the Pope in disguise in Minnesota, it wouldn't take you very long to realize that, okay, he's not connected to reality. What if I truly believed that I'm not just Pope Francis, I'm the first Pope, I'm Peter, I'm the rock. Can you smell what this rock is cooking? I'm sorry, but if I really believed that I was the first Pope come back from the dead, it would not take you long at all to realize that I'm not connected to reality. And if I were to say I'm a butterfly, so far away from being a human being, it would be obvious. Now, I say all that because here's Jesus, and he doesn't come along saying, I'm a prophet. He doesn't come along saying, I'm the greatest prophet ever lived. He doesn't even say, like, I'm Elijah come back from the dead or Jeremiah come back from the dead. Jesus doesn't even say, like, I'm another creature, another creation. When Jesus comes on the scene, who does he say that he is? He says that he is God. He claims to be the source of all being, and that he himself is holding all being together. Now, if you talk to a person who truly believed that, they would be so disconnected from reality that it would not be hard to spot. And yet Jesus is more connected to reality than anyone you've ever met. What that means, it means we only have one remaining option. If Jesus isn't lying, and he's not crazy, that means he is who he says he is. That's the only remaining choice we have. That he actually is who he says he is. Now, again, go on this one more piece on this. That's not automatic, right? Just because someone claims to be God doesn't mean you're all automatically going to follow them. It doesn't mean you're automatically going to believe them. He has to prove it. So that's actually what Jesus does. I mean, remember I said one of the places where Jesus claims to be God, it's Mark chapter 2, where you remember the story, there's the four friends and they have their fifth friend who's paralyzed. He's on a mat and they lower him through the roof, and Jesus, seeing the faith of the friends, he says to the man who's lying on the mat, who's paralyzed, he says, my son, your sins are forgiven. And then everyone's going nuts. They're like, wait, who but God can forgive sins? And Jesus is like, I know, right? He's like, to prove to you that I have the authority, the ability, the capacity to forgive sins, to prove to you that I am who I say I am, he says to the man, rise, pick up your mat, and walk. And he proves that he is who he says he is. And this is what all of the miracles are. In fact, in John's gospel, John calls miracles, he calls them signs and wonders. He calls them signs because they point to what Jesus is saying as true. I mean, here's the story of the man born blind, which is so incredible and so radical. Can you imagine? Grown man, his entire life, since birth, has been in the dark. And Jesus comes up to him and puts some mud on his eyes. Go wash over here. And this person who has spent his entire life in the dark can now see because there's some mud. Not because of the mud, not because of the washing, but because of the one who did it. In fact, he even says, the man born blind says, has anyone even ever heard of this? No one has ever even heard of the reality, the possibility of someone born blind having their sight again. And Jesus says, yeah, that's because I am who I say I am. Think of that little 12-year-old girl. Her father had rushed to Jesus because she was sick, and then she had died. And what does Jesus? He takes her by the wrist, and he says those two words, Talitha cum, little girl, arise. And she comes back from the dead. There's Lazarus, right, who has died, and he's dead not just a couple minutes, not just a couple hours. He's been dead 4 days, and Jesus doesn't do CPR resuscitation. Jesus simply says, Lazarus, come out of the tomb. And Lazarus, this dead man who'd been dead for 4 days, is now fully alive. Speaking of fully alive, the biggest proof that Jesus is who he says he is the fact that he went to Jerusalem and he was arrested and he was tortured and he was crucified and he died. And the very people who saw this and took his body off of the cross and wrapped his body in linen and laid his body in the tomb 3 days later were not expecting to see that body alive. And he appeared to them, proving that, no, I actually am who I say I am. That's the reason. Again, go back to this. If Jesus isn't God, he gets nothing from you, not even a thought. But if Jesus is who he says he is, then he gets everything. So much so that, look at the apostles. Every one of the apostles, they said they saw him die. Every one of them said they saw him rise. They saw him alive for 40 days after he had died. And what did they get? What did they get? That got them not a life of fame, not a life of ease, not a life of comfort, not a life of wealth. It only brought them trouble. It only brought every single one of them torture. In fact, all 12, except for John, were martyred. This last summer, there was a young man who said, we were talking about this, and he said, many people can die for what they believe in, but no one will die for what they know is a lie. Many people die for what they believe in, but no one will die for what they know is a lie. And all 12 of these men, they said We saw him dead. We saw him alive. And this is the truth. So we know. We know the answer to the question. We know who he is. I mean, even in today's gospel, right? Not only does Jesus prove that he is who he says he is, but in today's gospel, Matthew chapter 16, Jesus also establishes a church. And this is incredible, that Jesus is God. And he demonstrates this. He proves this. He is who he says he is. And also this God says, okay, Peter, you're now rock. And upon this rock, I will establish my church. I will build my church. And the gates of hell will never, ever prevail against it. So the whole thing is, this is true. Like what we're doing here, all of this is true. And it's been handed on down to you and to me. So this is who he said he is. And what we're doing here is who other people say he is, that he is God and he's established a church. And that's when we have to get to this last question. And the last question is the personal question that Jesus asks in today's gospel. We know who he says he is. We know who others say he is. Who do you say he is? I think too long we use other people's answers, but this is one question that no one can answer for you. This is one question that no one can step in and say, oh, no, here's who she thinks he is. Here's who he thinks he is. This has to be personal. So it's a question only you can answer, and we answer it with our voices, and we answer this question with our choices. Right now, today, in this moment. Years ago, not too many years ago, but a little while ago, there was a young woman. Her name's Megan. And Megan had come to campus. And in all the outreach events that we've been doing over the last few days, she was at all of them. It was awesome to see her around. She was getting connected. She's making friends with people. She's connecting with the missionaries. And I'm like, oh man, Megan's awesome. She's in, you know. And she was. All her next 4 years were just, she led a Bible study. She was in discipleship. She helped so many women get closer to Jesus. And remarkable. Her senior year, her last year of school, like a week before graduation, she's like, hey, Father, can we go walk around campus? Like, you know, like the old days. She's like, sure, of course. So we had to walk around campus and we had this talk. And as she was talking, she shared with me, she said, remember that first weekend I was on campus? And I do, because she was just like, wow, she's everywhere. She's awesome. She said, yeah, on Saturday night before Sunday morning, before Mass, I didn't know if I would come the next day to Mass. I was like, oh, what? Okay, strange, because she was going to everything. She said, yeah, I said, if I get up in time for confession before Mass, because we have confession before every Mass, if I get up in time for confession before Mass, then I'll go to Mass. And if I don't, though, I'm not going to go to Mass. And if I don't go to Mass, I'm just going to take off the next 4 years from being Catholic. And it was one of those, as she shared this, my gut just dropped and I got cold. I was just like, oh my goodness. Like I just think of how her whole life is just hanging on a razor's edge in this moment. Just this thread of like, if I get up in time for confession, I'm in. And if I oversleep, then I'm just going to take off being a disciple of Jesus for the next 4 years. And the crazy thing is that Megan is married to a man she met in this community. And that man is the mother of her children. And her life is so full of blessing. Every good thing in her life right now comes from that choice. The choice that only she could answer. And I'm just so grateful because it's small choices. It's small choices like, okay, I'm going to get up, I'm going to show up. Okay, this is no big deal if I sleep in. Actually, it can make a big difference. No big deal if I show up. It actually can make a big difference. I think sometimes that we underestimate the power of our small choices. I came across something the other day that, this is the last thing, came across something the other day that it reminded me that it said in all the movies or stories about time travel, like when someone goes to the past, they have to be really, really careful that they don't like change anything, because the butterfly effect, right? Is that idea, like if you change one small thing in the past, like everything's gonna be different in the future. So you have to be really, really careful if you go to the past to not even change a small thing. And it was pointed out, like, wait a second, if we give that much power to our past, that even small things can completely change our future, how come we don't give that much power to our present? That even small things we do can change our future. So here's my invitation. I'm going to invite you this week to answer this question. Who do you say that Jesus is? And I invite you to actually write it down. Who do you say that Jesus is? You might say, okay, he's my Savior. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of God. He is God. He is the one who knows my name. He's the one who has carried my shame. Maybe you say, he's my friend. Maybe you say he's a stranger. Maybe your answer to the question, who do you say that he is? Maybe it's like, I don't know. Maybe that's your answer. I don't know. Maybe the answer is, I don't care. But my invitation is this week, answer the question. Like, take time, write it down. Because it's a small thing, but it's a powerful thing. To take time to answer that question this week. Because it's a question that no one can answer for you.